My name's Victoria Betton and I work for the NHS in Leeds. My background is as a social worker and I started my life working in the voluntary sector. But I ended up slightly by mistake ending up working in the NHS and never quite got around to leaving. And I used to manage services, corporate services, support services, but more recently, over the last year and a half, I've been running a digital health programme called Health Habitat. I'm also doing PhD research about social media and mental health. And I met Dave, your chief exec. We were both speaking at a Health 2.0 event in Manchester, just round the corner, probably about a year and a half ago. Probably about a year and a half ago. Yeah, and then he asked me to come and speak after that. So what I was doing then, I was managing external partnerships and communications. What I'm doing now is quite different. But today I'd like to share some learning and experience from my PhD research. And then I'd like to talk a little bit about the digital health programme that we're running in the NHS. And I know you guys are working predominantly with pharma. I'll be giving you quite a different perspective, I guess, from how you attempt to do digital innovation within an NHS context and all the constraints, but also the opportunities that arise from working in that way. So I hope that sounds all right, and it was sort of what you were expecting. I'm going to aim for us to chat for about an hour and a half. I do not want to stand and talk to you for an hour and a half non-stop because you'll be bored rigid and I'll run out of things to say. So I'm hoping we can have a bit more of a conversation. So if you guys have got questions, want to check things out, throw a thought or comment or idea in, please just get on and do that because, otherwise it might get a bit dull. So I'm really interested in co-production. People familiar with the notion of co-production? Yes, some nods, some not. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Whilst I do work in mental health, I also work in health more generally now. So my background's mental health, but I'm going to talk about health a little bit more broadly. And first of all, I just want to talk a little bit about Twitter. Now, you're quite an unusual audience for me because often when I'm talking about social media and digital, I'm talking to health and care professionals. And whilst you may be aware there's a burgeoning sort of community of nurses and other professionals on social media channels like Twitter, there's also quite a bit of fear and worry about social media. Is everyone just massively immersed and engaged in social media? Yeah, okay. So some of these slides might be a bit like, oh, that's bloody obvious. For people, and has anyone got a health background? Has anyone worked in the NHS or in the public sector? So health, okay, clinically or?
More like kind of more support side.
Support side. Okay, and?
I just worked in finance.
Okay, right, okay. Well, I bet there's no talk about Twitter in finance in an NHS trust. So I suppose it's easy to underestimate the culture shift there is when thinking about very emergent conversational channels such as Twitter, for professions that have been trained and used to working in quite a tight sort of context, a context in which they're trained to have the professional knowledge and expertise, which is then mediated directly. So they're used to that sort of channeling of information. So this provides huge opportunities, but also creates a lot of fear and worry. You might be aware that all the professional bodies pretty much now, for the different professional groups, have social media guidelines. When the General Medical Council introduced theirs a year and a half ago, one of the things they said was that doctors should never be anonymous online. They should be accountable for themselves when they're online, and they should never be anonymous. And that created a right old hoo-ha. And lots of doctors actually went off Twitter, no doubt set themselves up in some other way, and some other people actually then took on their own names and interacted in a different way. So there's huge amounts of debates, and probably these are not things that you guys even think about, but the notion of using social media in a healthcare context is still comparatively novel. Have people heard of We Nurses? So We Nurses is a mega Twitter community. They've got around 33,000 followers, We Nurses. And We Nurses was set up by a woman called Teresa Chin, who is agency nurse on Twitter. And she was feeling a little bit disengaged and on her own and wanted to find a community, so took to Twitter to do it. And it's been massively successful. They do continuing professional development chats online on Twitter. They have case studies, they do book clubs online, they do all sorts of different stuff, and that's a community that's growing and growing. There's We Paramedics, We Docs, there's all sorts of different groups. So there's a really active group of people online. But if you go into an NHS trust, what you'll probably find is that most channels are locked down. So people, of course, still access them on their phone, and the attitudes to social media are quite variable across trusts as well. So some have a fairly liberal, permissive approach, and some have a more sort of controlled approach. So we're all learning online anyway, aren't we? My goodness. But I think particularly in healthcare, there's a lot of learning. So I very much see Twitter, for me personally, as an innovation tool, because I think what Twitter does, as do other social channels, they get rid of the temporal and spatial boundaries, don't they? So we can connect to people without the need for proximity around common interests, but also we can connect with diverse groups of people. And in my PhD research, which I'll talk about more in a minute, that's how professionals are using, often the professionals I interviewed, were using social media to understand what it was like to experience a mental health service. So they were learning a lot from their interactions and their connections to people who were predominantly tweeting about accessing mental health services. And one medic said to me, I spend my whole day in my clinic with other nurses, with other doctors. I have no idea what it's like for people in their everyday lives, apart from what they tell me in the context of the clinic. But actually, when I'm on Twitter in the evening, chatting to people, I realise how tough it is. I get a sense of what the challenges are around accessing services. So they actively use it to deepen their learning, deepen their empathy, and to connect better with people than they would otherwise do. It'll load in a second, I think. So that's just a little bit about Twitter that might seem utterly obvious to you. And, you know, we've all got our favourite channels, haven't we? But Twitter is absolutely my favourite. I also blog. So when I started my PhD in 2012, I decided to sort of blog my journey as a way of sharing my learning, but also getting input from other people. And I found that a really valuable way to get insights, but also to try and make a contribution, because if you're doing a 4-year PhD, no one's going to have any sense of what you've been doing until the end of that 4 years, if at all. So it's just a way to keep the conversations going. And again, in academia, I think the notion of blogging is still pretty, there's quite a few academics starting to blog, but it's a very different discipline and a different approach than they're used to in terms of public papers, I guess. So are you guys blogging? Supporting companies to blog, presumably? Yeah? Okay.
Can I ask you a question about the We Nurses thing?
Yes.
Is that UK based or global or predominantly UK
it's based in the UK. I don't know how many people from other parts of the world get involved in those chats. I guess the NHS is quite specific, isn't it, the context in the UK. So I don't know the answer to that, but ask Teresa Chin, she'll tell you. Yeah, it's a really interesting community, and it's grown so quickly. And I suppose what's interesting to me is that they're taking their CPD, their professional development, right to the edges of the institution, and because they have that conversation in public, patients start getting involved as well. Yeah. So it's that sort of transparency and accountability and just sort of stretching the boundaries of an NHS trust, of an institution, that I find really fascinating. So I'll just briefly tell you about my PhD. I am totally a practitioner. I am not an academic and never will be. This has really stretched me in terms of my preferences, because I just like getting on and doing stuff and producing stuff. So the discipline of doing lots of thinking and theorising and reflecting has been an interesting learning curve. But I'm writing up now, so I'm just in the final stages. I'll finish at the end of the year, fingers crossed. But when I first started getting interested in social media, or first sort of got on Twitter, I don't know, 2011, 10 maybe, I got very interested in the fact there were lots of people accessing services talking about mental health, often quite critically, and often there were conversations that I didn't see happening anywhere else, but people were coming together around common themes and common concerns, and often sharing loads of peer support as well, which I guess is going to be of interest to you guys. So I got very interested in that, and then I found a blog which is now sadly departed called The World of Mentalists, and it was a slightly, anarchic is not quite the right word, but it was quite a disruptive blog. It was written anonymously by somebody accessing services and a mental health nurse who was anonymous at the time as well. And they curated what they called the Matosphere. So they called it the Matosphere, and they did a weekly curation of blogs. It's really funny now, there's so much more content on YouTube and Vimeo, but at the time, when I think about it, looking back, it was very, very blog focused. Probably that's shifted quite a bit now. So I got really fascinated by all these conversations, all these challenges, the fact they were anonymous, and the fact that people accessing mental health services and professionals were operating in quite what appeared to be quite an equal way in the space as well. And actually, I mean, no one calls it the Matosphere anymore. The blog went at the end of December 2013 because the main bloggers got interested in other stuff and went off and did other things. Yeah, it felt very disruptive and quite intriguing. So I got them to agree to let me interview them, and I started interviewing people that participated, and then I did field notes. So I participated in the blog, I helped curate it. So my research is really, it's a tiny, teeny part of online social networking. And it's something that actually, in the time that I've been researching, has sort of moved on and dissipated. Most of those people are still there, but they wouldn't define a space and set of practices as they did do as the Matosphere. And as I said, I was really interested in how institutions were getting disrupted. Any questions about PhD stuff? No? Okay. I'm going to tell you about... do you know what, I'm not going to play you that because it's so bloody obvious. But if I was playing this to healthcare professionals, so it's just a bit of a, you know, this is the penetration of social media. Because I think, so I did some training for some health professionals about a month ago, and it ranged from people quaking at the thought of touching an iPad through to people saying, well, I get it all, but this is completely irrelevant to my role. So and people in between who were very competent and very frustrated that they couldn't use it more in a healthcare context. So there's a whole sort of range, but even when people are really competent, they still don't know, or it's not easy to apply that competence and translate it from a personal context into a professional context, if that makes sense. Does anybody remember when Asda had a bit of a disaster with their mental patient costume? Do people remember that? Yeah. So it was one of the case studies in my research, but I think it's a really interesting example of activism and how a corporate organisation like Asda can be pulled to their knees, albeit for a short amount of time, and they recovered pretty quickly and moved on, but just how disruptive people can be when they come together collaboratively. So for those of you that don't remember, I'm trying to think now, maybe it was in October 2013. Amazon had it up as well, as did eBay, but actually it started off in Leeds in the sense that one of our consultant psychiatrists emailed me and said, my wife was online last night looking for Halloween costumes, and she came across this, and if you've seen it, it's absolutely appalling. And it was a costume of a sort of a bloodied figure with ripped clothing, I think an axe, and it said mental patient, and I can't think what the strapline is, I should have got you the picture, but you'll be running away from this terrifying mental patient. So, have people heard of the Time to Change campaign? Yeah, so there's a massive, UK's biggest campaign challenging mental health stigma. So there's huge amounts of work going on in the UK trying to challenge negative representations, stereotype representations of mental health. And for those of you that, there are people here doing some mental health stuff, yeah. So you'll know that the association between mental distress and dangerousness is a really toxic stereotype that is actually very inaccurate. But of course this Asda costume was completely reinforcing it. So the psychiatrist emailed me and our chief executive, and I found out afterwards that he'd rung up Asda and he'd rung up customer relations and he'd said, I want to make a complaint. And they said, well, we understand what you're saying, but this is probably going to take 2 weeks or so to take down. But of course, things don't move that slowly on social media, do they? They do when you make a phone call on a one-to-one. And Asda headquarters is based in Leeds. So I happen to know their head of social at the time, Don Birch, who some of you might know. He's worth following on Twitter or connecting with if you're interested in social media from a corporate point of view. And they recognised straight away it needed to be taken down, but it just took them ages. They didn't get it down till that evening. In the meantime, our chief exec tweeted it. And I watched it go one evening. I don't know whether anyone's watched a Twitter storm happen in real time, but it's a joyous thing. Just to watch a little tweet here, little tweet there, it just sort of mushroomed and ballooned and grew. And then people like Jack Dee started tweeting, Ricky Gervais, I think, tweeted, Alistair Campbell started tweeting. So comedians, celebrities, public figures. Not particularly because they were necessarily interested in the topic. I think Jack Dee's tweet was, I'm going as the managing director of Asda this Halloween for my costume. He said it better than me, but you know, that was the tenor of it. So by the end of the evening, it was already getting into mainstream media, and by the morning, it was, I think, the lead item on Breakfast News on Radio 4. And Sue Baker, who's the director of Time to Change campaign, was on the 1 o'clock news programme on TV. So Time to Change have been trying to get into have that higher profile for years and years, and it was the kerfuffle that was made by people accessing mental health services and professionals who sort of united and really started talking about it and sort of amplifying it, that sort of brokered it into the mainstream media. So I guess what's interesting as well is how increasingly mainstream media source their information and their news stories from social media as well, as you will know. So that was just a really good example of individual activism and the activism being able to take place in the public sphere that enabled people to connect together. Asda were really, I interviewed Dom for my research, and he's very happy for the things that he said to be shared, but he just talked about sort of shouldering the waves, the crashing waves as they went past, and just sort of saying we're sorry, which is what they did. They dealt with it very well, actually. They apologised, and doesn't want to stay up, does it? They apologised, and they were pretty much left alone pretty quickly, actually, and they donated something. And they just sort of moved on, whether it'll happen again or not. In fact, the next year, those costumes came up again. They didn't come up on Asda, but they're still around. You'll still find them now. So I don't know how much resonance that has for the work that you guys do, but I guess what's interesting to me is how people can collectively come together around an issue. And of course, there's many other non-mental health examples. The Arab Spring is an example in which Twitter played a big part. And there's huge amounts of research about that as well. But this is the area that I know fairly well. It was pretty stunning what people managed to achieve. Now, I don't think it changed the world. I don't think it I think the biggest effect it had was a sense of community between the people who participated, that it gave a sense of belonging and identity. And why I absolutely loved it is that people did this sort of culture jamming thing. So they totally messed about with and made humorous the whole idea of a selfie. So, you know, my kid's just selfieing non-stop, but it's all about how beautiful am I, my makeup's perfect, I look fantastic. This was about, I'm an ordinary person and this is my mask, you know, get real. So they really played with the idea of the mental patient costume, but also played with the notion of a selfie as well. And there was some really good humour. And I think when it's a really serious issue, being able to give it some irony or humour or satire really sort of starts engaging people as well, doesn't it? Rather than feeling like you're being wagged to by somebody telling you off. So anyway, it was a really interesting example for me, and it was one that I wrote up in my PhD. A couple of weeks later, The Sun's main headline, 1,200 people killed by mental patients. Nothing has changed. The mainstream media are still doing it all the time. The research does show that the mainstream media are representing mental health better, but that tends to be the softer sort of problem page type, this is how I live with depression. When it comes to violent crime, that was inaccurate, that headline. The Sun headline was very inaccurate, and they apologised for it later in the small print. But when it comes to crime, that is a very pervasive stereotype that's really damaging for people who are living with mental health problems day to day.
Can I just ask a question?
Of course you can.
In the time you've been studying it, have you noticed a difference in people's willingness to come forward and participate? Like in this, so
Yeah.
I think today perhaps is different to when you started.
Could people hear that? So that was a question about whether there's a shift in terms of people's willingness to talk about mental health online. I can only give you an anecdotal response. So I can't give you an evidence-based response, but I would say absolutely. So when the Time to Change campaign set up about 5 years ago, they didn't even have social media in their mix because it just wasn't on their radar. Now they're just pushing out tons of social content all the time, lots of little vlogs, videos, and most of it's user-generated stuff. So, and I think the fact that you've got the visibility about people being prepared to like a page or make a contribution or retweet something is quite powerful, isn't it? What would your reflection be?
Well, there's quite a few people in here actually working on as a patient campaign at the moment. It's in depression. And I think we've sort of seen that as well from the research, thinking about, Laura, what you've done. And people think about the stigma. We've done work in a lot of areas as well where you can imagine there's a lot of stigma. So it's just looking at how actually that's become something that people are willing to do. As at first, I'm a depressed patient, do I want to sort of admit to that online?
Yeah.
More as sort of Twitter becomes,
Yeah.
social media becomes integrated as part
Yeah.
of life. It's almost like there's a bit of freedom somehow to sort of express yourself in that way, whereas you might not do it in real life.
I think one of the things that social media channels afford is the ability to take productive risks, but in a safe way. So you can take risks with your identity or what you choose to share, but in a way that's still fairly safe, and you can contribute to the public sphere, but from within the safety of the private sphere, if that makes sense. So in my interviews, some people were actively talking about mental health non-stop. That was the one thing they talked about online, but they might not talk about it at all in other aspects of their lives. And then some people were using social media channels not to talk about mental health, but just to have an ordinary life. So one person I interviewed was so consumed with social anxiety, she never left the house, but she had brilliant relationships and connections online. So she didn't talk about mental health, she didn't really want to go into that, but she just used it as a way to be who she really felt she was, rather than somebody constrained by the social anxiety that she experienced. So, I mean, I'm giving you a very positive take. There are, of course, risks and challenges. So there's a guy called Johnny Benjamin. Did anyone see the Find Mike campaign? Yeah. So the Find Mike campaign had a lot of media publicity, didn't it? And that was a guy who somebody had saved him on a bridge in London, Waterloo Bridge I think it was, and he wanted to find him. And it was a really good campaign for raising awareness of mental health, and it had a bit of, you know, drama attached to it and so on. But Johnny's had death threats, so he makes YouTube, he's a vlogger, he makes YouTube clips, but he's had death threats. Charlotte Walker, bipolar blogger, is another big blogger. She won a Mind Media Award a few years ago. She gets trolled, you know, so there's the downside as well. And I think this is why, so in an NHS context, this is why clinicians need to be much more engaged with social media channels. So they need to be, when they're supporting people around their day-to-day lives, taking productive risks, managing vulnerability, setting goals, are they helping people think about their online lives blended into their offline lives? Well, quite often they're not, because they don't understand enough about it themselves, or they don't think of it when it comes to a clinical context. So I think increasingly there's an imperative, I would say, for clinical staff to be understanding social media.
What is your thoughts on social media actually exacerbating mental illness? So people go online and see all of these like pictures of people having fun and out having fun, like
Yeah.
sat at home. Is
Yeah.
that another sort of dark side to it?
Yeah, what do you think?
I think that it is, and people can now compare themselves a lot more to their peers. However, it's stuff like this and sort of raising awareness of mental illness that is combating that and actually going to change it so it's more positive than negative views.
I did read some research a while back. It was some research on Facebook that sort of said once you get over, so if you have up to a certain number of friends, I think it's about 200 or something, it can be quite, it can build your resilience, but once you tip over a certain point, then it tends to reverse, the effect gets reversed, and you get the whole FOMO and, you know, feeling inadequate and everyone's having a good time. But that's why clinicians need to engage with it, don't they? So they can help people work through this stuff and use social media in a way that builds their resilience and makes them feel better about themselves and encourages their recovery, rather than being vulnerable or being subject to bullying or feeling like, you know, my life's not as good as other people's. So absolutely. All of this stuff it's all about sort of the tectonic plates moving around and just trying to find equilibrium and balance, I would say. But yeah, absolutely. Okay. The other thing I just want to say, actually, because we've just started a digital inclusion programme with the Tinder Foundation, and Bob Gann from NHS England speaks really well about digital inclusion, which is another bit I'm thinking a lot about. And he says, and there's evidence to back it up, that our degree of health literacy directly impacts on our mortality and our outcomes if we're unwell. So the better our health literacy, the longer we're likely to live. Increasingly, health literacy is mediated through digital, so we get information online. So if people are digitally excluded, that will have a negative impact on their health and well-being and their outcomes. So I think it's really important to think about digital inclusion and exclusion. And of course, the big challenge is that a lot of people access services are the most excluded people who are least likely to benefit from social media and digital tools unless there's additional support. So we've got to be really careful that we're not increasing inequality through an emphasis on digital. It's something I worry about and think about a lot, and we're working a lot in our programme. So I think when you're thinking about any sort of programmes around digital, you really need to be thinking, not you personally, but one needs to be thinking about who's being left out here and who's not involved and who might this disadvantage. Did anyone see the Samaritan's radar debacle?
Yeah, wasn't that when they could detect whether or not you were suicidal from your Twitter?
Yes. So the Samaritans, in a very well-intentioned way, developed a Twitter app called Samaritan's Radar, which they launched with a big aplomb to the mainstream media. And if I was following all of you on Twitter and I signed up to the Twitter app, without any of you knowing, Twitter would surveil all of your tweets, and if the algorithm indicated that one of you might be suicidal, it would send me an email on which I could choose to or choose not to take some action. And of course, it was done with good intentions. I don't think the algorithm was very good because people started playing with it straight away. So I could tweet later on, spoke at this event, it was an absolute disaster, I feel like I've had enough. And it would, you know, and I was being a bit silly, and it would end up on somebody's inbox. So the algorithm didn't work very well. But also there are a lot of people using social media, as I've described, for peer support, and they didn't want anyone taking any action, and they also felt like their privacy was being invaded. Even though those tweets were in the public domain, it was encouraging people to take actions which weren't necessarily welcome. So this is quite contested, sort of nuanced space as well. And again, my expertise or my knowledge is more around mental health, and I'm no doubt there are similar issues elsewhere. But those sort of issues of agency and control are really important when people have often felt control is taken away from them in the context of health services. And so, yeah, it just needs to be thought of really carefully. And Samaritan's Radar are just, Samaritans withdrew the app, and they're now doing a proper engagement process, which they're in the middle of at the moment. Digital Futures, I think, is the hashtag. Okay, have people come across Rebecca Brown? No, I'm just going to show you this nice little, very quick little vlog. So she talks about, I can't even say this, trichotillomania. Anyway, it's an impulse condition where people pull their hair out, and she made this short little film. So it's just, I think, my research is about the blogosphere, and everyone was sort of 30s to 50s. There's a much younger generation of people using vlogs to get messages over around mental health. So let's see if I can make that work.
You ought to know that the world isn't fair. This life doesn't owe you anything. It's in your hands to make your own luck, live your own life, your way. Will you count on me when the world isn't kind and it leaves you behind all alone? Just remember, dear, you are a strong one. You will not let it knock you down.
Don't look back, just keep your head up. Don't look back, just keep your head up.
My name is Rebecca Brown, and that was 6.5 years of my life. Woohoo! Pretty scary stuff. If you would like to see more of the other videos that I create, apart from taking photographs of my face all the time, then you can click here, and this will take you to my personal channel. On the other hand, if you would like to learn more about my hair condition trichotillomania, the reason why I kept losing all my hair and going bald and stuff, then you can click here, and this will take you somewhere else. Yeah. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
God, it's made me go quite dreamy, that has. Any reflections? Do we think it's good, bad? People know of other vloggers? Zoella? People heard of Zoella? Yeah, so, I think what's interesting about her, and I don't know so much about Rebecca Brown, Zoella, she mostly vlogs about beauty and makeup, I think, but she's also vlogged about her anxiety and depression, and she's now Mind charity ambassador. So the charities are getting pretty smart, aren't they, at getting that sort of peer-to-peer, harnessing that sort of, I haven't got it here, but they've got huge amounts of followers, so harnessing their audiences to try and get some of those sort of charity messages across as well. But some of you guys know better than me, but the trend is that we believe our peers more than we believe people in authority. That's who we look to for product advice, for support. I went to a breastfeeding group recently because we're going to do an app around breastfeeding, or we're not going to actually, but we're thinking of. And I was really interested in hearing the new mums talk because they said, well, I know the health visitor has to give me the advice I'm supposed to have, but if I've got a question, I've got 5 or 6 Facebook groups, I put a call out, get 10 bits of advice, I'll choose the one that most suits me. So they're just not that interested. They want to know what the professional advice is, but actually they were more interested in what their peers were saying and that sort of sense of, I guess, mutual understanding and reciprocity they get from their peers. Zoella's another interesting example. So there's a whole community of vloggers, and in fact the title of that is a Guardian article that came out a month or so ago. So if you're interested, have you seen the article? It's a nice little article, isn't it? And it's got loads of embedded films in it. So if you're interested, just shove that into a search engine and you'll find it. Now I think some people have come across Michael Sears. Who's come across Michael? One person. Michael's spoken at a Health 2.0 event there, hasn't he? You said, yeah. This is quite a long film, so I don't know, maybe we'll come back to it maybe. But Michael and I, he speaks at stuff, I speak at stuff, we've spoken at stuff together. He was at an event I ran last week. And this is not a non-mental health context, but this is more moving into digital innovation, so digital tools. So Michael's really interesting because he's had Crohn's disease since the age of 12, and he was one of the early bowel transplant patients when it was still very new. And if you've had a bowel transplant, you have a stoma bag, and a stoma bag, basically a bit of your bowel comes to the outside. There is no way of monitoring when that's full. So if you're asleep at night, for example, it can just overflow. But also, the doctors ask you to measure how much it's filling up and so on, because they want that sort of information. And Michael was like, as he says in this video, I'm going to slightly replicate what he was going to say, much less well than him, but much more quickly. That he was like, well, there's got to be a product out there that helps me measure this. So he went online from his hospital bed and couldn't find anything. So he made it himself. So he hacked his own, I think he did, got a load of stuff from Amazon, watched a few YouTube clips, and hacked his own device and app to measure whether it's filling up, so that you can change it before it overflows and just causes huge amounts of distress and embarrassment and bother. Now, I'm really interested in people who are innovating around digital and social media out of their own personal experience, because they know what the problems are, right? So when Michael developed his product, I can't think what it's called, can you? No, I can't remember what it's called, but if you Google, he's MJ Sears on Twitter, or if you do a search for him, you'll find him. But he consulted with 20,000 patients because he's got a massive community through his blog and his vlogs. So he had a ready-made peer community of patients, and he did lots of testing with them and checking out with them. Now, of course, he's trying to sell into the NHS. And if you do watch this is just, it's a Stanford medicine. If you put it into YouTube, you'll find it. It's so hard selling into the NHS. So he's selling into the US really easily, and he's doing really well there. But, you know, it's a medical device. It needs to get MHRA approval, But it's not just that. It's hard work selling into the public sector generally. But his story is just so inspiring. When he first wanted to have an appointment with his consultant, and he asked if he could Skype his consultant, the consultant agreed, but none of the nurses would stay in the room at the same time because they were so worried about getting into trouble because he was Skyping a patient. So just this fear of using digital tools in a clinical context. He told me recently that he's from his hospital bed, he's done like a Google Hangout with 6 consultants across the world about and advising them from his experience. So he's got huge amounts of experience from his personal his personal life and experiences that he then goes on and shares both with his peers but also with clinicians as well. So he's utterly inspirational. If you ever get a chance, I'm sure he'll be at Expo in the autumn. Is it? Yeah, September. But he's definitely worth hearing. You should try and get him back to Health 2.0 and get these guys along. People know of any other patient digital entrepreneurs? This is a loaded question, actually. Do you know anyone doing some interesting stuff around digital from a patient?
There's someone in Chorlton or Didsbury, so in Manchester,
Uh-huh.
who has schizophrenia.
Okay.
And he's been video blogging for a while.
Okay. Okay. So he video blogs about his experience.
His life, yeah,
Uh-huh.
So he's kind of living with schizophrenia.
And what's he? Do you know what his purpose is for doing it? Does he talk to you?
Probably reducing stigma, raising
Yeah.
awareness.
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
Yeah. I think that's usually people's main interest or motivation rather.
In Salford, who's living with Alzheimer's, and she isn't doing it to raise awareness or anything, but she's sort of trying to make things more Alzheimer's friendly. So she's kind of like, she finds a place and she really likes it and they know what to do with her, and then she makes it an Alzheimer's like safe haven and tells people about it so that other patients can go and know that they're in a safe environment.
Nice. Oh, that's nice. That's nice.
I know several people with mental health problems who blog regularly, and it's for them it's communication release
Yeah.
in a kind of channel of their own kind of setting, where
Yeah.
they're kind of setting the ground rules for discussion.
Yeah. So it's that sort of taking control.
Sure,
Yeah.
being the definer of a situation because you do feel very, very
Abs-
powerless in
Absolutely. Yeah, very true.
That's like social media for a therapeutic reason.
I think there's an evidence, isn't there, around writing and diary keeping as a therapeutic tool, and I think that's often what people are doing, but they're just doing it in a public space. But when I started my research, I reviewed a lot of blogs about mental health at the time, and quite a few of them are locked down, so there are people blogging, but just for a defined community around them rather than completely in the public sphere. A couple of years ago, I wrote a blog post with a woman who had her phone confiscated. You just reminded me of it because she's a blogger. And I can't remember whether she was sectioned under the Mental Health Act, but she ended up in an inpatient unit. And the inpatient unit confiscated her phone. And they did it because they said they were worried she might blog while she was an inpatient and compromise the privacy of other patients or staff. And she did get an apology from the Trust in the end because the Care Quality Commission and your human rights, actually, those sort of blanket bans are not acceptable, apart from in forensic units where you can remove people's phones. But a lot of inpatient wards don't have policies or procedures to account for it, so it comes down to the particular viewpoint or prejudice of an individual member of staff or a team. We're just trying to get one of our inpatient units having completely free public Wi-Fi for when people are inpatients, because actually, I mean, my God, I'd be beside myself if I couldn't keep in touch with people day to day through social channels. Does anyone follow Tea and Talking on Twitter? So Helen Hutchins is fabulous. She's a mental health nurse. A couple of years ago, she ended up on an inpatient unit in crisis, and she live tweeted her whole experience. And she didn't tell the staff she was doing it, but she did it in a really, really boundaried way. But she had a pretty grim time. I've written a blog about it. It's on my blog somewhere. So everything I'm sharing with you is in the public domain, and she was happy to share. But she actually, the thing that really struck me that she said was that the time when she was an inpatient, she felt she got more support from her peers on Twitter than she did on the unit. And that's where she got her succour and her support. And actually, she had a pretty grim time on the unit. And she was talking to all sorts of different people, but I curated it and I blogged about it. And then she shared that blog with an executive director from that trust, and they did meet up, and I think they apologised to her, as I understand it. So that's really common. I think that's common now. Lots of people are live tweeting those sorts of experiences, but at the time, it was a little bit shocking. There were lots of people sort of watching, going, oh my God, that's really brave, and how are services going to cope with it? And she kept the organisation anonymous, so she was very boundaried and discreet. But it was a real insight into what it's like to experience a service. And she had this dual experience of feeling very disempowered in one context and very out of control, but then very empowered at the same time in the context of Twitter, which is quite an interesting.
Do you think it was appropriate for her to do that? Because she was in crisis, and she was maybe not in the right state of mind to be revealing information about herself in a public manner. So could social media actually be a way of almost violating your own health privacy?
Well, I think I'm going to keep coming back to this point. This is where clinicians need to be engaging with social media. So a good clinician and a good NHS trust would do an advance decision with her. So an advance directive is like a refusal of treatment, but you can, when you're well, you can create an agreement about how you want to be when you're unwell. So I also know of people when they become unwell and they become inpatients, they ask to have their phone, they don't want their phone taken away from them at the time, but it's agreed in advance they will do. This is all about planning, I think, and all about having the conversations and working out what works for one person and what doesn't work for another. For her, it was a really positive experience, and I think it probably got her through that hospital experience. The other flip side of that, of course, for clinicians is what was once the private domain, the one-to-one conversation, can potentially be in the public domain, can't it? So there's a real sort of challenge around accountability and openness and transparency for clinicians, that actually they might think they're having a conversation in private, but they're not. Do you remember the parents who took their child off to Spain because they want, and they put that YouTube clip out, didn't they? So they were like right in there managing the media really actively, and I think the trust sort of caught on a little bit after, but I assume that's going to happen more and more. It's how people expect to, as they interact with brands, they expect to interact with the public sector as well.
You might come on to this, but I was going to ask a question about the content. So in other words, we've seen an increase in people using social media, especially around topics like mental health. Is the content and what they're asking or putting out there changed and evolved over time as well?
I don't know the answer to that.
Is it more?
What's your gut feeling? What do you think?
Maybe it's gone from just basics understanding of conditions or questions to maybe the confidence to put in personal experiences or sharing treatment choices or whatever it might be.
Yeah, maybe. And there's lots of online communities out there. And I came across there's Ella Friends, run by National Mind, which is a sort of a closed online community. But I came across one for young people actually only today that I wasn't aware of through Twitter. I think people have been doing that for a very long. When I first started my research, people were doing that, but it felt like it's probably more people doing it, just because social media's increased so much. The usage of maybe.
Do you think it's also related to like campaigns like Time to Change? Do you think it's also related to stigma? Do you think that actually there's been some success and people are more likely to share? Because that's sort of what I was thinking.
Yeah.
I think that's had a positive impact.
They're more confident about sharing certain things than they would have done historically.
Well, I think what Time... So just coming back to the Asda case study, what Time to Change did brilliantly was they just sort of harnessed it all and took it into the mainstream media. That would have been really hard to do without Time to Change being like able to front it up. So there was someone ready to sort of get behind all those campaigners and sort of support them and then go, right, we can broker the mainstream media sort of contact. Again, it's purely anecdotal, but well, in fact, the time to change evaluation does show they're having some success as they measure it, and there are some shifts going on in mainstream media reporting of mental health. Anecdotally, I would say, well, it's definitely increasing, and possibly there's more conversations, and they're in more spaces, on more channels, I would say. But I don't know whether how the nature of the conversation is changing. That's an interesting one. A little bit of PhD research for you there.
I was going to say, do that for your next PhD.
Yeah. Never again, I can tell you, never again. Okay. I think, I don't know how that funny little thing got in there.
Nice, I like it.
Yeah, how did that happen? And can I do that again? I don't know. But I was doing it on the train, and it was the last slide I put in, and I think we've pretty much had that conversation. Is there anything else? What does this all mean for you guys in terms of your work? Is there any resonance? Does it?
Well, like Camilla was saying before, we're working on a campaign at the moment, a patient campaign aimed at people with depression. So this is useful to get a grounding for how we might use social media, how we might recommend we engage with social media as part of that campaign.
Yeah.
I guess.
No, you go.
No, sorry. Just following on from that quickly, the interesting thing for us is that we're obviously working on behalf of a pharmaceutical company. So what you've been talking about, sort of time to change, sort of Samaritans, it's a different sphere. So if you've got any sense of how
Pharma can engage with
yeah,
that.
how anything sort of from our perspective, anything you can be cautious of, or any insights into how that differs from charities?
Well, I would learn from Samaritan's Radar. I think that these are predominantly conversational peer spaces or peer practices, and when a brand with an agenda, particularly around selling something, is in that space, I think you're going to get a mixed response. I think that the contested nature of mental health diagnoses and mental health medication are being talked about all the time. So it's not like there may be some conditions where the medication bit's just like, yeah, that's just what it is and that's good, but that's not the case in mental health, is it? So, and you know, those are, I've got my own personal views, but those aren't really relevant, but it is very contested. So I think it's hard for any brand without huge amounts of resource to do well in those spaces. When I managed our communications team, it was really, really hard being there in a useful, collaborative way and not just broadcasting and being boring. I think there's loads of institutions making social media very pedestrian and boring. And just by the fact there's lots of them there, people feel constrained, I think, in what they're able to say. So I definitely noticed a shift in the time of my interviews from people thinking this was career enhancing, it was around career development, I can get myself out there to, or my organisation doesn't like the fact that I've got this position in the organisation, but here on Twitter I've got this status, and that's a bit uncomfortable. So I think that's probably happening in lots of different contexts, but there's quite a rub, isn't there? So I think you need to be aware of it, and I'm sure you are already.
I think that's where you use, like you say, different organisations and patient groups and so on. You can engage with them and work with them rather than it being a company, a brand trying to...
I would always amplify and support and enable people that are doing good peer stuff, because that's, you know, that's where the real value is for me. And that's what we're trying to amplify in my work, which I'm going to tell you about in a minute. Yes?
Being in the kind of the organisation of the NHS, we talk a lot about empowering patients, we talk a lot about all this stuff, there's been a lot of patient campaigns and patients putting themselves out there to talk about that. For me, what I find more complex about it, and not just in mental health but across the board, is around that bringing that engagement with the healthcare professionals as well to match up with all the empowerment that we do with patients. Because if you consider how patients are interacting with social media and the fact that then you're talking about the examples about when they come into hospital and they have these potentially negative interactions with healthcare professionals, to me there's a huge piece that's missing around the empowerment of healthcare professionals to then have those confident discussions with patients who are increasingly getting more empowered with technology as well.
I agree with you.
Do you kind of feel that from your position?
Yeah. So when we started the Health Habitat programme, which I'll tell you about in a minute, I had under-anticipated how much work we'd end up doing around digital literacy and digital maturity of the health and care workforce. Yeah. And we're just having some conversations in Leeds about a citywide approach to digital maturity across health and care, because there's been a lot of investment in digital and technology, but there's a sense that we're not going to be able to leverage it unless health and social care practitioners are engaged in it. So I think there's a real mismatch.
Do you feel like there is kind of going to be more of a push towards that? Is that something you can feel within your...
Yeah, and NHS England are pushing it as well. So there's Code for Health, which they've just launched to get GPs coding. Medics, I think it's predominantly coding. And if people are interested and aren't aware of the National Information Board, they brought out quite a long document called Personalised Care 2020 in November last year, but that sets out sort of the vision for digital and for technology-enabled services over the next bit of time in support of the 5-year forward view, which was like the strategy for the NHS. So there is a nationally there's a big drive, and about open standards and so on. I really notice a mismatch. So boards sort of know they have to do this stuff, but they don't really understand it, and they find it a bit confusing. So there's quite a mix, I guess, between what people know they've got to do and their capability and their understanding, and it's really variable. But I think you can't just do transmissive teaching. You've got to you sort of got to do that peer, I think a sort of peer approach. So Tinder Foundation get digital champions who then go and sort of support other people around digital inclusion. So that's one approach that seems to work quite well that we're looking at.
Victoria, I have a question. In our communications with sort of mental health patients in certain medias, how appropriate is humour? Now, I will suspect if it's coming from authority, it's probably not acceptable. If it's coming from peer groups, it is.
Yeah, that's a really. I've been really fascinated by I've done a whole thing about the role of humour in my PhD research, but it's been more about the sort of the positive effects of peer-to-peer humour and satire, because you create the other then, don't you? I think corporates and institutions have to be really careful in appropriate use of humour, because it's so easy to... Yeah. However, Time to Change have used humour quite well in some of their stuff. So they did an advert about a year ago, which was a guy in the office coming back from a period off sick, and that was a really silly, humorous advert. So I think they've trodden it quite well.
See, my thinking would be that if it's insightful into the issue and it's coming from peer to peer, it's probably shared humour.
Yeah.
But if it's from outside and it isn't that insightful, then it's like somebody putting their finger in.
Yeah. Yeah. Language is very contested, isn't it? So the Madasphere, as a word that was used to describe this space, was very much a word that was used by people in that space. But I interviewed professionals who said, well, I'm on the edges of that space. I'd never use that word because I could really offend people. And so I think there's some, particularly in a mental health context, there's some real sensitivities, because language is really powerful, isn't it? So I try and be really careful about my own use of language.
It's just that humour is a way of really communicating.
It is, I agree.
Permission to be a mere scientist to do it.
Yeah, yeah, you do. And I guess the Time to Change campaign have got a lot of support behind them, haven't they? So people know what their intentions are, so they're able to use humour. They've got a lot of leverage already, whereas another organisation might not. So I'd be very careful about humour, and I would really check it out with people.
I think it
first.
also depends on the individual, and lots
It does.
of things like personal taste, like how long they've had a condition. If you've just been diagnosed, for example, humour probably isn't the way to go, because actually there's lots of new scary stuff.
Yeah.
And maybe I don't want to be amused at that point. But if I've had a condition for a longer period of time, I'm living with it.
Yeah.
I'm comfortable with it, and managing it.
Yeah.
Then maybe humour's more appropriate.
And some people use humour just to... So a great person I follow on Twitter is Mental Political Patient, and mental political parent, and she's just a really, really funny tweeter. But she tweets about mental health quite a bit. But she's just tweeting from a very particular place, isn't she? So yeah, the only place I've seen it done well is Time to Change campaign. Probably quite fraught with with difficulties.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's okay.
We say that patients are active on social media, but how my opinion, there's only actually a small percentage of
Yeah.
people who are willing to go out there and say, I have a mental illness, I need these coping mechanisms. So, in your experience, how many of like your day-to-day mental health patients actually do talk about these things online in a non-anonymised way?
Yeah. Well, I'm not a clinician, so I'm not working, I'm not working day to day with people. We run a lot of events, and it's really variable, I would say. So some people are really into it, some people are very cautious. But I guess it's how you define participation, because if you like the Time to Change campaign, if you like it and it shows up that you like that campaign, you're sort of making a statement, aren't you? And I can't think how many likes they've got. I don't know whether you guys know. It's a lot.
It's different though from liking something
To actually actively,
having, to saying I have this
Well, only a teeny percentage of the population actively produce content. So that's the other thing. Most people just read content. So if you're interested in the Oxford report of internet cultures, is it comes out every year. And they have, they sort of categorise participants in social media. It'd probably be really useful to you actually if you haven't read it. And I think they're called immersives, are people who, they're the people I interviewed who are really into social media, use it all the time, produce lots of content, vlog. They're like 12% of the population. They're comparatively small. So they've got sort of four layers of participation. So even in the general population, that's a tiny percentage. Yeah.
In kind of slight answer to that, I've heard criticism from people I know who are suffering from mental health problems that some of the recent campaigns in recent years with celebrities and so on kind of have had the thing that sending out the message, it's okay to have mental illness as long as you're charming, you're successful, you're attractive, and so on. But if not, you're not in the radar. Really.
Time to Change have really moved away from that whole celebrity endorsement thing, which is where they started. Lots of people find that really problematic, in my experience in the conversations I've had. We had, when I used to be responsible for communications, we had people like Ruby Wax and Alistair Campbell and Frank Bruno come and talk. And it was great for getting mainstream media interest. Frank Bruno was brilliant, by the way. He was absolutely great. People adore him. But it wasn't very good apart from Frank Bruno being the exception in terms of getting people's engagement. It's like, well, they're so far removed from my life, which I think is why they've moved more to general user-generated content. And then I guess people like Zoella and Rebecca, who we saw, they are the celebrities for young people. My 12-year-old looks up to Zoella and watches all her makeup videos. She's a superstar to her because that's her world. She watches YouTube mostly. She doesn't watch much TV. Yeah.
I think there's a danger with any kind of organisation and affiliating themselves with an individual. It's like any, forget this sector even, any sponsorship or anything like that, there's always a risk that person takes a wrong turn somewhere and your brand's associated with them.
Yeah.
Tiger Woods even,
Yeah, who'd have thought it?
So, you can easily kind of fall foul, I think.
Yeah. My sense is the trend is to more sort of peer content rather than celebrity, and I think there's a bit of admiring people for speaking out, but there's a bit of well, you can do that, can't you? But I suppose people that have their own lived experience who are in the public domain also sometimes want to use that, use their celebrity in order to get some messages across. So, I think it's a tricky one, that, and it varies from person to person maybe as well. Anything else? Yeah. Okay. How are we doing for time? Okay, I've got 25 minutes. So I'm just going to, I don't know how interesting this will be to you, but I was asked to speak a little bit about the programme I run. So I run a programme that's been going for a year and a quarter, so we're still doing little baby steps at the moment, called M Health Habitat. And the M is mobile, by the way, rather than mental health. People tend to think it's mental health. And that's us on Twitter, M Health Habitat. And this came out of my interest in digital and social media, and I was doing quite a bit of work around recovery principles in the trust, and it just seemed to me that we really needed to be thinking about digital if we were thinking about innovation more generally. So I got a little bit of money from the commissioners to build some digital tools and services, just have a go and learn through doing. And it was just me and a graduate trainee at first, but using that money, as well as learning through doing and building digital tools, we also started building a model of how you do digital within the NHS and how you manage all the different constraints that exist, and we're still learning about that. We also chose the metaphor of a habitat because we wanted to create a community around digital. So a bit like those Health 2.0 events that we mentioned earlier, I was really interested in how you bring people accessing services, so patients, developers, designers, industry, academics, all together to have conversations that's not in a pitch and sell sort of context, but in a let's collaborate and share learning. So, so we started running various, I'm just going to tell you very briefly about this. This is the model we've been developing. So I run a lot of workshops, I don't know if we're going to keep the name of Digital Academy, but that's the broad umbrella. So just to give you an example of the sorts of things we do, we're just about to run one with a PhD student at Hull University around the use of Skype and nursing. So he's been doing a lot of research with nurses about their attitude towards video conferencing in clinical work. But one I did a few weeks ago, which I absolutely loved, was the application of Minecraft in a clinical context. So I got a digital arts practitioner who, is anyone into Minecraft here? No. Oh, God, no one into Minecraft? Well, he's wizard keen anyway. He's wizard keen, and he's just been to LA and launched some YouTube channel with Disney. So he's a digital arts practitioner, he's mega into Minecraft, and he ran a workshop for health professionals. And you had everyone from like, well, I really disapprove of Minecraft, through to, oh my God, we do social storytelling with people with a learning disability. Could we create mini games in Minecraft and engage them in that way? So we had huge amounts of fascinating ideas. And actually on our mHealth Habitat blog is the transcript from a CAM psychiatrist, so a child and adolescent mental health psychiatrist. And he uses Minecraft as a therapeutic tool with his patients. So he had a young man who was really into playing Minecraft, and sitting face to face and having some clinical conversation was not very conducive. So they sat and played Minecraft together. And he was like, I don't know, right-hand man builder to the boy creating his world. And they used the world as a bit of a metaphor for, for his mental health and his well-being. So I think there's something about how you use existing digital tools but use them in different ways because people are already engaged with them. So that really interests me. So Minecraft is an example. We're running a digital innovation lab with a group of young people looking at mental health and digital tools. And do people know Mark 1 in 4? If you're not following Mark 1 in 4 and you're on Twitter, you do need to be. So he's like Mr. Twitter. And he has lived experience himself. He runs it for us. He's running one this evening. And they have a chunk of money to build digital tools and services themselves or commission them. And this is our model we've been developing around digital innovation. So catalysing digital innovation, working with services to get them thinking about the potential for digital, problem solving, rapid prototyping, discovery days. Incubate is us doing all the project management, procurement, getting stuff built. I'd love to be doing more in the adopt space, but we're still doing a lot of building at the moment. And the embedding is the more strategic work about getting digital in the consciousness of trust boards, of citywide priorities, and digital being an enabler rather than an end in itself. So when there's a service redesign going on, going, right, okay, what's the digital component of this? Can digital make a difference in terms of convenience, access, flexibility for people? I don't think all this stuff is necessarily going to change the world. I think sometimes it's a bit like online banking, just makes life that little bit more easy and more straightforward for people. And also the banks get us to do all the work, don't they? So, and we've been thinking a lot about standards and modularity and integration. So we're acquiring and building quite a lot of code. So we're building it open source for people that are familiar with open, so that we can make that available to people. So we are going to spin off maybe into a company owned by the NHS, but we want to build that repository of code that's available for other people to use. And I've talked about this sort of thing about the confidence of the workforce around social media. So we call it a digital compass. So thinking about things like personas, values, audience and relationships, content. People, you can do a load of techie, this is how, well not techie, but you know, this is how you set up a Twitter account. But unless people feel confident about these things, they won't tweet anyway because they're too nervous about it. So you've got to think really carefully about what's this for, you know, all the stuff you must be doing all the time, but people don't always think that strategically about. But we're also thinking about if somebody comes into your clinic and they've got an app with them and they want some advice about is this a good app to use, well, helping them think about what the things they ought to be checking out and thinking about, yeah. And there's a big NHS programme at the moment, NHS England are leading some work around app endorsement, so they'll be launching in June, I think, an app endorsement sort of kite marking type process. So there's some big moves around open standards, around modularity, and around endorsing apps that will go onto the NHS Choices website, I think.
Haven't the NHS already tried to do that?
They've got the NHS Apps Library, which never really, oh thank you, never really took off, so it hasn't got many apps on it. Is that what you're thinking of? Yeah. So the NHS Apps Library, they only reviewed really for security and safety. So it was reviewed by clinicians, but I don't think they had a great deal of resource behind it, whereas this time they're doing something more integrated into NHS Choices because they have huge amounts of traffic to NHS Choices every day. So they just launched earlier on a couple of months ago some IAPT, so improving access to psychological therapies. They launched 5 IAPT compliant digital services endorsed and on NHS Choices. So Big White Wall, some of you might be familiar with, Silver Cloud, those sorts of services. So that's the direction of travel. I don't know what people think. Are people going to go to NHS Choices to go to apps, or will they just go to iTunes and Google Play? I suspect most people will go to Google Play, but...
Well, no, like they are looking for information on the website, find what they want,
and then see a digital tool, yeah. I mean, the payment models are quite tricky. So you can go on to NHS Choices, see Big White Wall, think, blimey, I'd love that. But if it's not commissioned in your area, it's not available. So that's a problem at the moment about availability of digital tools, and it's completely random. Yeah. Has anyone been recommended an app by their GP or health professional ever? No. No. I mean, I had my over 40 health check with a practice nurse, and she was talking about keeping healthy and walking, and I said, well, what apps would you recommend then for me to self-monitor? And I hadn't even ever thought of it before. She was like, oh. So it was a slightly cheeky question just to see what she'd say. But yeah, I think it's really, really variable again. And then some clinicians are suggesting apps left, right and centre, but what are the data privacy issues, the authentication, do they align with NICE guidelines? So, you know, there's a whole sort of balance, but this is a very emergent space. How are we doing for time? Right, I've got a nice little film about co-production, but I'm not going to play it to you because we haven't got time, but it's called The Parable of the Blobs and Squares, and it's just a really nice little, if you're interested in co-production and collaboration, and rather than the top-down doing 2, it's a really nice little film to watch on YouTube, so I'd highly recommend it. Just want to talk a little bit about a few methods for collaboration and co-production. Has anyone ever done open space? Been to an unconference open space event? So this is a really, really nice frame for an event if you want to generate ideas and generate collaboration. And I ran one based on open space last week. So we're all here for open space event. I'm your facilitator. I get a big sheet up on the wall and I divide it up into 8 chunks. And we've got a frame for the day, which is, I don't know, digital, social media and pharma. And I say, right guys, who wants to convene a conversation? What do you want to talk about? So you might say, right, I want to talk about this. Someone else says, I want to talk about that. So if you've said you want to talk about whatever it is, then you go off and take responsibility for that conversation. And you populate your 4 or 8 conversations, and people then choose what conversations they go to. If no one goes to your conversation, that's probably a little message that your conversation isn't that relevant to people, which is good learning in and of itself. But the 4 principles are whoever comes are the right people, so the conversation you have will be generated from the participants in the room. So it's not you know, this is like, oh, so Victoria knows more than other people. Well, I don't. You know, we've got loads of collective expertise in the room. So it's rather than someone standing at the front talking, it's more about let's generate participatively conversations that work on the assumption that everyone has expertise. Whatever happens is the only thing that could have. So again, that comes back to the right people are in the room. Whenever it starts is the right time, and whenever it's over, it's over. So you practice the law of 2 feet. If you're in the conversation and it's boring or it's not relevant, we can do the very un-British thing and get up and move and join another conversation. So, I mean, if you Google open space or open space methodology, you'll find it online. But I just thought, thinking about co-production and collaboration, it's just a really, really nice way when you're running events of engaging people in a highly participatory way, and I really like the principles that underpin it. So we do quite a bit of open space type events. We run show and tell events, so we have a bar in town that we go to about once every 2 or 3 months, where we get people accessing services who are entrepreneurs or have something to say around digital, developers and academics or clinicians, and we have 3 or 4 speakers and a conversation, a few drinks in the bar. So it's a bit like the Health 2.0 events that were mentioned earlier. We're trying to find lots of different ways to convene conversations. That will work for some people and it won't work for others, so we're not just doing one thing. We also have workshops called Heart of the Habitat, and they're morning workshops. We provide breakfast for people, and they're aimed at people accessing services, or other people can come along as well. We give people a really nice breakfast. We have a really interesting speaker, and then we have a collective conversation on topics like digital inequality, data privacy. We're going to look at behaviour change theory next time, and the outcomes and the outputs from those conversations help inform our sort of direction of travel, if you like. So I'm just giving you a little bit of information about the sort of things we run. We run really nice little discovery days, which are like hack events, but they're hack events with a purpose, because there's a question, there's strategic buy-in, and then we do something afterwards. Usually we end up with a prototype at the end, but I'll just show you, just give you a sense. This is the Open Data Institute in Leeds, so it's a really nice space if you're ever in Leeds and need to buy a user space. So that's the Chief Exec of Leeds Community Healthcare, who sort of came along to look at the outputs from the day. So you'll know if you've been to any clinical environments, they're usually, they're not the most joyful of places or, creative of spaces. So we like to bring people out, get them into a really nice space and do some really good collective creative thinking at the beginning, and problem solving and prototyping and doing customer journeys. So we use sort of service design thinking to do that. And I suppose just a few sort of final reflections from my learning, which is still, I've never made so many mistakes as I've made in the last year. It's just like every week, it's like, oh, damn. So we're trying to learn from all our mistakes and not do them a second time. But one really sort of big challenge is getting that strategic buy-in and the bigger picture, but also just deliver stuff and do stuff on the ground. Everything from the discovery days to, right, how do we get digital in the strategy of the organisation? So I guess that's a really, that's been a big tension for us. These are my learning. These are all obvious and they probably all, second nature to you, but definitely with all this stuff, everything comes down to relationships, doesn't it? If you can get the relationships right and the trust and the collaboration, you can do great stuff together. And I spend a lot of time sort of brokering relationships with external organisations, with academia, so that we can do collaborations in the NHS. I think sometimes you just got to get on and do it. and not wait for permission, but just sort of, so that might be the culture of your organisation. It's not necessarily the culture within an NHS context. Finding the evidence is important, so having that evidence-based approach, but in a digital, there's not very much evidence, so it's also about generating the evidence. Definitely, you know, obvious again, there's a lot of digital innovations that are out there that are clinically efficacious, but they're horrible to use. So you know that design and the creative is, when we do app reviews with groups of service users, the design is almost more important than the content. That's what people look to first and foremost, which again will be obvious to you. I really think this is important, this bringing unlikely people together, and we're trying to do a lot of that. Always being generous, and you know, you've heard it said before, I'm no doubt, but we're not very good at failing in the NHS. And actually, sometimes it's really important not to fail because it's people's lives. But in this context, actually fail fast, try things out, do little experiments is definitely the approach that we've been trying to take. So, for what they're worth, those are my reflections. And that's me, that's my email, that's me on Twitter, that's my blog. Any questions, comments, reflections, challenges? Any alignment with what I'm doing, with what you guys are doing? Are you building digital tools? Apps? Yeah?
You do.
Yeah? All right, okay.
I
Yeah.
had a question. I mean, I was looking at the, the board that you had there of like the learning and the stuff that you guys do, which is great that you make it interact.
Yeah.
And maybe involve learning more about the disease and things like that, which I think is incredibly important. I was wondering if you ever find that there's a pushback against sort of the commercialization of like some diseases with like new medicines being available and things like that.
Yeah.
Like, it's pretty bad in America. There's a lot of people on Xanax
Yeah.
all the time and stuff like that. I
Yeah.
don't think it's quite that bad over here. But do you ever see like a pushback against that, or what your views are?
Yeah. The US context is very different, isn't it, with healthcare insurance, and that's why probably people like Michael find it easier to sell in the US than they do in the UK. I mean, one of our principles is that everything we develop is free at the point of demand. We're not buying stuff to sell. We're not making stuff to sell to patients. So we've been thinking a lot about our software strategy and our business model for how we do this stuff. And we definitely need to build a sustainable approach, and that's why we want to go down. I think we're going to go down, and we've already started building for open source, but we haven't got enough capacity. Our team's only 5, so we contract out to developers to build stuff for us. That might change over time, I don't know. But I don't want to go down a route of people paying for digital tools and apps and services. Things like Big White Wall people can choose to pay for as private individuals, but in an NHS context, that doesn't feel right. I don't know if that answers your question. In terms of the bigger pushback about medication, it's not really my space. We are, we've just contracting with a company called U Motif, so U, small u, big M, and they've developed a beautiful shared decision-making digital platform that we're going to deploy in mental health that has got medication reminders within it, for example, which has gone down really well, actually. People are quite keen on that component of it, but that's only one thing that it does. Yeah. So yeah, it's not really my space, if I'm honest. But in terms of digital, I think we're... Yeah. Anything else?
Yes, just sort of going back to, or a bit related to what you said about the NHS coming out. Do you know anything about how widely information prescriptions are being used? Because I'm aware that they exist, but I haven't. I've read about them on websites and seen
Yeah.
a lot of space on
Yeah.
the NHS website, but I've never known them.
Yeah, there's social prescribing and information prescribing, isn't there? So I know in Leeds there's some projects around social prescribing. I happen to know that in Nottingham, the Mental Health Trust is developing digital information prescriptions. So as I understand it, it's Health to Works, so Health to Works, who are developing it with the Mental Health Trust there. And I can't remember how personalised they are, but of course, NHS Choices have open APIs, so you can pull stuff into your platform from NHS Choices, like information, and presumably you can personalise that information. But they're doing some work around information prescriptions. I think they tend to be at primary care level, but that's in secondary care. But yeah, I think the whole area of social prescribing, information prescriptions, art on prescription has an evidence base behind it. So, you know, if someone's turning up at the GP a lot for mild to moderate mental health, they're isolated, they're feeling unconfident, actually is a referral to an art group going to be as efficacious as or more than antidepressants? You know, it might be or it might not be, but those are the sort of options that we need to be thinking more about, social prescriptions. And there's sport prescriptions, aren't there, where people get prescribed going to the gym for free or going swimming. Yeah. So I don't know loads about it, but, but I can put you in touch with, if you are interested, give me a shout and I'll put you in touch with the guy in Nottingham who's developing them. Yeah, the digital versions. Okay, let's see what time it is. Got 3 minutes to go, so shall we wrap it up? But thank you very much. I feel like I've talked a lot, so thank you very much for listening to me. Thank you. And if you've got any questions outside, then just tweet me or